Hello, everybody, and welcome to Positive Fandom. I am your host, RM. And of course, we have with us today for our Horatio Hornblower Season 1, Episode 7 review is Darth Plato. Darth Plato, how are you doing today?
Hi, it's nice to be on. Thanks for having me.
Well, of course, it's a pleasure to, first of all, thank you for agreeing to review this series that I love, Horatio Hornblower. And we're like the second to the last episode. And it's kind of taken longer because I've had some intermissions and stops and everything in between. But certainly it hasn't stopped my enjoyment of talking about Horatio Hornblower, who I could probably talk about incessantly. Um, so thank you for meeting with me today. And I was a little bit late because I was on one other stream and I had to wrap up with someone else. But I'm so happy that you agreed to do this with me. Last week we were talking about the previous episode of Horatio Hornblower. This week we're talking about episode 7, which is called Loyalty. And it is very interesting because just like many of the episodes of the series, you find Horatio and, pretty much a good portion of the sailors who are with him on their ship and they're fighting. And then out of nowhere, or at least it feels like out of nowhere, Darth Plato, they find out that the war is over. And it's kind of like an initial elation, but the reality of the fact of the matter is that once the war is over, it's like the sailors are kind of down and out. And I know I kind of asked you this question last week because I thought that was the episode that we were covering, but the sailors do look like they're down and out. We even find out one of them was in a prison. Darth Plato, what happens when you have a bunch of able-bodied men who are accustomed to this sort of arduous lifestyle that doesn't give them much back, on, kind of like stranded at shore with no way to support themselves? It looks like they're kind of devastated. It's almost like they're furloughed. What would happen to these men during those times when there would be this lapse of war? And I know I asked you this question last week, but I feel like I have to ask the question again because at first they seem very happy, and then you see them and they're all kind of like, Horatio is in a bad way. um what did you think about it and how it was depicted in this particular TV series?
I'll do your first question first.
Yeah.
Um, there's a difference between the men themselves and the officers. Now, with the officers, they're going to be reduced to half pay. And they're probably going to receive a letter that says, we do not have a posting for you at this time. Because whenever your post ends, you have to report to the Quartermaster General's office. And they would give you a new assignment. So the war's over, that means there's going to be less stuff going around. I believe Britain did maintain a certain posture after the war because it was a widely held view, especially in the government, that this was not a good treaty. So there was something of that. The demobilization wasn't as extensive as it was, say, after the Revolutionary War and after the wars with Spain. Now, in that case, you did have a large-scale demobilization, and it did put a lot of people out of work. See, in those days, there was quite a market for men with those kind of skills, martial skills. Men that know how to sail could probably find a job on a merchant ship. So I don't know if some of those guys would have been as out of work as they're depicting. They probably would have found work. There's always a boat looking for people, especially in those days. There would have been all kinds, especially Britain as an island, sailing all over the place. There would have been all kinds of work for these people. An officer, however, no, that's different. Horatio probably would have had a hard time finding something. Um, he very very soon into the episode, he meets Pelu. He gives him an assignment. I suspect that Pelu probably had arranged for Horatio not to be picked up by another ship, to be given another ship.
Oh.
Right? So because Pelu knew that this moment was coming, that
Yeah.
there's going to be the pressure is going to be on, and the affair between France and Britain are going to decline. Everyone knew it was going to happen. This point we're talking about is called the Peace of Amiens.
Mhm.
That was in March of 1802, and it lasted until the following May of 1803. So that's about 14 months. So that's 14 months where these guys aren't really doing anything. So who knows what Horatio was doing that whole time, or Mr. Bush for that matter. We do see return of Mr. Bush, who is in the same predicament as Hornblower, and he gets a job courtesy of Mr. Hornblower, courtesy of Pellew, and of course, who do they bring back? They bring back Mr. Hammond.
Yes.
Now, what was your other question?
My other question just was, how do you think they depicted it in the series that we saw, as far as you're concerned, for a television program? What did you think about the depiction of what we saw?
I thought it was pretty good. I think the only thing I didn't like was the fact that these guys were waiting for a ship to open up so they could get a job. Like, what was his name? The big man. God darn it. Look at, in those days, it was not unusual. We today think it's weird, but in those days, it was not unusual to go onto a ship from another country, and they would take you on the hand, and then you'd be part of that crew. That was not unusual. The British did it themselves. There was a Royal Navy captain in around 1801, 1802. His quartermaster came down with something. He came down with a disease, and he couldn't sail. And it was the day before they were going to sail. So the captain went into the local establishment looking for an experienced quartermaster. And he wasn't looking for an Englishman. He was looking for whoever he could get. And it turned out he found a Danish man who was experienced as a quartermaster, and he hired that guy. And you had a Danish national serving on a British warship.
Yeah.
So yeah, and that's true for the experienced sailor as well. Ships really put a commodity on. They put a lot of value on experienced seamen. So those guys wouldn't have been out of work for very long, I don't think. War or no war.
That is very interesting. Maybe part of the loyalty is that Horatio feels compelled not to take a job outside of, not that I think he can as a commissioned officer. I have no idea what the rules are. But
Yeah.
maybe he feels he couldn't go ahead and privateer. I guess he could have privateered if he wanted to, if he could secure a ship. We've heard of privateers at this time. They're not
Yeah.
unusual or
Oh,
unheard of. And of
Yeah,
course, there's, I'm
that
sorry,
was a thing. That was a thing, yes.
and there's Hammond and Hammond's nephew, I think, who uh, who Horatio meets at the club. This is an officers club
Yep.
that Horatio has been going into at night, gambling to try and make some coin. And he's kind of barely making it, Darth Plato. But what's interesting about it is that for Horatio, this, although it's not ideal, he still is able to turn coin. In a group of men, these officers who do have some money to gamble with. So some of these guys are more well off than others, and they are willing to kind of lose a few shillings here or there. But, in actuality, Horatio, I don't think he could just kind of like hang out with the local people and gamble and try and take their money. I don't think that would work well. Amongst these officers, a lot of it is social. And even if he does make this money, and everybody's like, wow, did you see he won $1,000? Unfortunately, Horatio has been pawning like everything he owns. He probably doesn't even own underwear anymore. Of course,
What I
I'm
thought.
joking, but he had to pawn his coat, and that's not a good sign. The only thing he has left, even the innkeeper who is there with him, is maybe just his uniform and nothing more. So times are tough. He pawned his sword. The chick who's in who's the innkeeper's daughter notices that he does that, and it does look kind of sad to see him have to pawn away everything. But when he's in the pawn shop, Darth Plato, we see that he's not the only officer who's had to do that.
Yep.
So it seems like there might be sort of like an ebb and flow of things like that happening in towns like that. Of course, the pawn shop owner is going to make his money back, as many of them do make turn a profit, but Horatio's in the dire straits. And I thought it was interesting that that shopkeeping girl, of course, here's Hammond, and you did mention Hammond is now a character again in the picture, along with his nephew here, who's as green as they come, as green as Horatio, I guess, was when he first stepped on a ship. But this shopkeeper's daughter, the funny thing about her, I thought, was that she had mentioned something about how, she really cares for Horatio. And Horatio's like, you know what? I'm kind of a nobody. And he doesn't necessarily, he's just being honest with this girl who really seems to like him. But I thought it was really interesting because, he let her know. He's like, I'm not, I don't really have anything to show you. And I think it was very interesting. It's true that he is in this beautiful uniform. He looks very stylish and everything, but he's kind of telling her, I don't really have anything that could benefit you. I think he's wondering what she sees in him. Now, for me as a woman, naturally, we're just going to notice how hot he is. So, it almost didn't matter that he had, this uniform or anything like that. He's an attractive guy, but he can't understand why any girl of any, like value would ever find him attractive or want to be with him. And I think that that's very interesting because I think that's, a very realistic approach. He even mentions in this episode how for a long time there wasn't anybody who even cared whether he lived or died. Now, I would argue that the Admiralty has invested a lot in Horatio at this point, and they do care if he lives or dies. In fact, some of these places, maybe not for him, would put in a life insurance policy if they could on him in case they lose him and they could get money back for it or whatever it is. A lot of them are heavily insured, but it is interesting to see how Horatio sees his let's say role in the status of society. Do you think he was right in that description of himself? And is he ever going to kind of move on up a little bit, Darth Plato?
Well, he can move on up if he gets promoted and gets into the peerage. Getting into the peerage will get you money. But I don't believe he has a peerage at this time. I think he's just a lieutenant. So he was just holding the rank of commander temporarily. So he is receiving lieutenant's pay at this time. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
So it's a little bit different in those days than now. Nowadays, we don't really think of the family. We think of we're more individualistic than we are more family oriented. So guy dates girl, dates guy, and one thing happens, they move out of the house, you go to college. But in those days, things were different. In those days, you really did take notice of what their family was. And can your family support another member of the family? Can I afford to marry into this household, and vice versa? So when Horatio is wondering about these things, he's probably thinking about it along those terms rather than me. You're interested in me? Why? I mean, he probably realizes that he gets a little of attention from the fairer sex, but it's more than just how you look in the mirror. He's looking at himself like, well, I don't really have anything. I don't really have a family to speak of. That would really get me a lot of notice. So I think that's what he's doing. I think also he's just naturally he's not a braggart. He's not an egotistical guy. I think he's being humble at the same time. I think there's a humility to it also.
Yeah, that is very interesting that he may not be as arrogant as his peers. And you mentioned the peerage. I wasn't quite sure how. I mean, I know the king would give you a peerage. You get a peerage from the king, but a commission is from the king, isn't it? Like
no,
or
a
not?
commission. No, a commission is not the peerage. A peerage is completely different. It's the peerage is like on a tier, like the duke and the counts and the
Mhm.
barons and the
It's a
viscounts.
writ that
And
gives you
yeah, the
say as
lowest rung would have been sir, like a knight.
yeah.
He is not a sir for sure.
But the commission comes from the king, or does it come from somewhere else?
Well, the commission simply means that you've earned the right to be an officer in the service of the crown. That's completely different from a peerage. Like take Wellington for instance. Wellington was a career army man, and he was a commissioned officer, and he was promoted to the general rank officer. He did not have a peerage. He did not receive a peerage, I believe, until Salamanca, until his victory at Salamanca. I believe that's when he received. I think that's when he first received his peerage.
Yeah, and I don't excuse me. I'm assuming that they still issue peerages, but it's not the same. I mean, in a lot of cases at this time, from what I understand, people got peerages because of family connections. Even you got it through like a almost a birthright sometimes. Um, but people could be issued them. I mean, you could still issue someone today, and I guess they still get them. I've seen a few people get them a peerage. But what I find interesting about it was that we find Horatio saying things to the one of the other I guess people who are his subordinate on the ship, as well as that other gentleman who's a French. I guess he's an officer, but I'm not sure.
Or he came from a nice family body. That guy would definitely appear. You can tell by the way he dressed, the way he acts.
Yes. And Horatio was like, well, if you're hearing it from me, you're hearing it from the Admiralty. He has to constantly, Darth Plato, justify that he represents the Admiralty. And I also thought that was very interesting because here he is, he kind of, and as I said, and you said he's very modest, he's kind of telling this young girl, well, I'm not really that special. And yet he's representing the Admiralty. Of course, this is before he got his
yes, he's firm. Yes, that's the strength of his character. He's modest, he's humble, but at the same time, he's firm when he needs to be.
Yes.
So he's excellent. He's just a picture perfect example of what an officer should be.
Yes, absolutely. And he and one of the other, I guess he was just a not a midshipman, but what Horatio was, I guess, a lieutenant, demoted back to being a lieutenant. And, they're trying to kind of stay at this place there, at the boarding house. And they're like, well, you can stay as long as you pay. And we learn how he's kind of been living and winning by, winning hands of cards, which probably don't always give him the money he needs, or else he wouldn't have to pawn anything. But we do find out, as you said, that he ends up becoming the captain of I think it's the Hotspur.
The Hotspur, yes.
And he has to carry this Frenchman on. And the tensions between the English and the French sailors is still there. Did it ever really go away, Darth Plato?
Did whatever get away?
The tensions. Did those tensions ever really go away?
You mean between England and France?
Between the English sailors and the French sailors.
Yeah. In peacetime, yeah, I'm sure that they would have. You mean like the salute when they're passing by? Yeah, I'm sure they would have done that. There is a healthy respect for for service. So yeah, that doesn't surprise me at all that they would do that. I was surprised that they had people being nervous about it. I think the nervousness had more to do with the fact that they had been at war with France so recently, and when you're at war with a country for so long, it just kind of becomes like the air you breathe. It's like I've never been this close to a French ship without it firing on me. There's probably something like that too. But yeah, there definitely would have been a healthy respect. I mean, look at before World War One, Germany and England, they were having a lot of interaction between their sailors. Every summer, they had a sort of a combined fleet week where the English would disembark on German soil, and they had the English sailors and the German sailors. They all had like one big barbecue, and they did that every year, every summer, and that was like a yearly tradition.
Yeah, you make a good point, and there clearly does seem to be some kind of other respect going on. I think that these senior commanders are well aware of this French officer's status, social status, in addition to the fact, where he says he can just kind of hop a ride on, a British ship, which is no easy task to organize. But this is an important mission. There's some reason why he needs to get onto the shores of France. And of course, the reason why he needs to get on there is because he's not a supporter of Napoleon.
Right. And this needs to be explained.
Yes.
So if they're at war with France, why is there a French officer aboard the ship? Okay. Not to get into a big history lesson, but the reason why England and France are at war was because of the outbreak of the French Revolution. Long story short, there were a lot of emigres from France. The royalists and others, enemies of the revolution, fled the country, and they went to England. A lot of them went to England. So this French officer is part of that group. He, for whatever reason, would not side with the regime, or any of the regime, the French Revolutionary Government, Barras, or Napoleon, or whoever it may be. For whatever reason, he's in England, and he wants to. I'm not sure what his motivation, his long-term motivation is. All we know is just the mission. How long has he been there? Was it something about Napoleon? What, did he support? We don't know anything about his background, really. That's kind of unfortunate. So really all we know about him is he's probably most likely an emigre. And he's just there for the mission, and we don't know anything else. We don't know anything else about him.
Absolutely, Darth Plato. And I think, is it fair enough to say that this Frenchman suspects that Napoleon is not keeping the peace, but the British commanders suspect that's the case, but maybe the rest of the British soldiers are unaware that there are forces right there on the shore when they're going to land, so to speak.
Well, that's just how the story portrayed it. In terms of the story, yeah, that's true. The French are not honoring the spirit of the treaty, and London knows this, and they're being sent in, and they're the vanguard of whatever's going to happen. And they don't know what's going on. And Pellew tells them, "Look, this peace may not last much longer, but we're not going to be the one that breaks it." and that, unfortunately, that's part of the lie of history. The fact of the matter is that the British were actually the one that turned the treaty on its head, not the French. But they don't really mention that in the episode.
Well, I kind of like this character here. If I can kind of pause on him, I didn't actually do this a lot because every time I tried to pause on a certain character, I couldn't get it right away, and it does get dizzying to the viewer. But this character here, he decides to take him on. He is a good friend of Horatio's. We've seen him on a number of ships with Horatio, yep. And he agrees to sail with Horatio. Horatio gets some crew members that he knew from past sailings as well, Styles and one other gentleman. And I'm actually very surprised at how firm this man is as an officer.
Bush.
Yeah, I love how he will say things like, I think he tells Hammond, learn the ship like the back of your hand or you'll feel the back of mine, which is, I thought, yeah, okay. He's letting him know what's going to happen if he doesn't follow through and do what he's supposed to do. And then when one of the other, shipmates agrees to become a cook, and he sees that he's faltering as a cook, he says, look, you better learn how to cook or I'll cook you. And I love his like snarky remarks. They seem quite appropriate for that time period. Were they appropriate for that time period?
Oh, yeah. You would have heard people talking like that in Vietnam War. For sure.
Yes. But you know what I mean.
And especially in this time period. In that time period, they quite literally could have just marched you out into the water and just make you swim. They won't do that now because they don't want to risk drowning. So they won't do that now. But in those days, they absolutely would have done that. They would have marched you out into the water and say, see if you can swim. If you drown, you drown.
Wow. Well, I liked it because I think it showed, not that they could ever really show us all the harshness of being on a ship like that, but I really enjoyed seeing it because we know it's not all hearts and flowers to be on a ship like that. And, at some point, Horatio agrees to kind of do this mission, or not a mission, but let's say they're asked to go ashore to find out what's going on shore. Really, maybe one of the only ways to actually, they have to get a visual confirmation, I guess. That's what this is about. And the Frenchman did say, he's looking for his friend who's supposed to be on a boat. His friend doesn't show up. And there's this weird, it's not a drive-by, but it's a sail-by of a French ship. And they can't explain, why is this French ship out there? What's going on? And of course, the French ship is out there because they're delivering more troops, right, Darth Plato, for this action that they're trying to keep secret from the English.
It's silly, unfortunately. It is silly, unfortunately, that they did it this way. There was a breakdown piece between England and France. That is true. However, the breakdown did not occur because the French were massing troops for an invasion of England. The massing of French troops for an invasion did not occur until after the breakdown of Amiens. Napoleon had better things to do than to waste money mobilizing troops that he couldn't send anyway. He was very reluctant. He was very skeptical about the successful invasion of England. So that was something, the fact that he even considered it was something of a last resort. And that didn't come until after the war, the peace had broken down. Britain was in a weird place in those days. If you recall from the Podunk series, there was a scene where, what was his name? Podunk and another gentleman, they went to see the Prime Minister.
Mm-hmm.
What was his name? William Pitt. And they were told, oh, you haven't heard William Pitt resigned today. And they're shocked. William Pitt resigned. They couldn't believe it. So that was the Catholic Emancipation scandal, and Pitt had to resign, and that brought in what was called the Addington government. Now, why is that important? Because the Addington government was the one that really drove to get the peace of Amiens done. It was their initiative. They were the ones that wanted to say, well, let's make a name for ourselves. We're going to end the war with France. That's how we're going to that's going to be the success that we're going to stamp our administration on. The whole administration, the Addington administration, was a disaster from beginning to end. And by the time you got to the end of it, they were literally looking for an excuse to end the peace so that they can almost like a wag the dog. It was almost like a wag the dog like scenario and get back into the war and all the stuff about they didn't like the France's interactions with Switzerland because Napoleon went to Switzerland. Or they went to France. No, they went to Paris, the Swiss representative, and he literally made their constitution, and made it so that this was the beginning of the modern sense of French neutrality, the idea of not French neutrality, the modern sense of Swiss neutrality, the neutrality of Switzerland. Because Switzerland didn't like the fact that their territory was being crossed by Austria, France, and vice versa, and this way and that way. They wanted an end to that, and so France said, "Okay, we'll make you a deal." And this idea that, not to get into a long story, but there's the idea that London didn't like the prevalence of Napoleon with a lot of the European states. Are like, well, he's making constitution for Italian states. Now he's doing it for Switzerland. Who else is he going to be doing it for? So there was a legitimate concern just how powerful this guy's going to become. You know, this could be a problem for us in the future, and that gave fuel to the Pitt crowd and the others and the others of that crowd. Okay, this peace was a bad idea. This guy's going to be trouble from the future. And remember, the reason why the war started in the first place is because they executed Louis XVI and said, we're going to import this revolution to all the countries of Europe. And that horrified the countries of Europe. And that is why they went to war. They didn't go to war because they were outlawed by the death of the king. That was a terrible thing that happened, yes. But they didn't want dissidents in their own countries getting that idea in their head that hey, if France can do it, we can do it.
Yeah.
And that's why you had this massive coalition against France. That is why that happened. And the Addington government just kind of tried to set that aside and say, look, you can't just sweep this under a rug. There's gonna be war. All you're doing is giving him time to get France in order. That's exactly what happened. And the peace did break down, long story short.
Yeah, and of course, here's just a picture of the French officer with Horatio, and they land on shore. And of course, when they land on shore, they're flabbergasted by what they see, which is really a lot of troops. Oh my gosh, it's so many. Here they're actually.
Oh, and also, when the French did mass shoots for an invasion of England, it was not in that area. It was up near Boulogne, near north of Calais. That's
right.
Where they were massing. They weren't massing in this area.
Right. And, this is for the purpose of the story they had to put in there.
Yeah. The plot is a little silly, unfortunately. Of all the episodes in Hornblower, this is, the action's okay, but the overall plot is a bit weak.
Yeah. And well, what ends up happening, as you said, Darth Plato, is once they discover that there's all these troops there, Horatio and this Frenchman rush back to the Hotspur. Pretty much they just make it. If it wasn't one of Horatio's men saying that Horatio and the Frenchman were in the boat would have sailed off. Bush would have sailed that boat off. But there are some characters on board the boat. There's also sort of like some people on the boat who are Irish, and they also are expressing concerns with what's going on. And we learn later on that there is kind of an ulterior motive or plot going on, just even on the ship itself. I think it's very interesting, kind of like, even though they find out this information and they're happy that they found out this information, it turns out there's other things brewing on the boat. One of the members on the boat ends up getting kind of beaten up because someone has set him up. They set him up, making it seem like he.
Yeah, they made it look like Styles started the fire. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't, for some reason, this particular, it's the way that my pointer works. So sorry about that, but he gets in trouble, and it's all part of kind of a big conspiracy to kind of discredit Styles and cause confusion on the boat. That's another thing that it's done for. But this young fellow is Hammond's nephew.
Yeah.
And, this is his first taste of war, I'm guessing, or first taste of anything. He's so green, and has been told several times he better learn how to do things on the ship, and he better hurry up. He looks older, or maybe he's around the same age as when Horatio hopped on board, but it is kind of late for him to kind of
He might have been. Yeah, Horatio was 17 when he was first episode.
Yeah, so maybe this kid is 16 or around there, but it does feel like he's very behind. And also, unfortunately, it doesn't look like he really wants to be there. He's freaked out by having somebody's guts, this blown up guts on him, which I'm sure would freak out anybody. That's not a good feeling, seeing one of your shipmates killed in front of you, but he really doesn't handle it well. And here's the other guy telling you, you better get it together. You better get it together. It's not your blood. You need to kind of step away from this. So it seems like the Admiralty is happy with the information that Horatio has found out. Now they have to take another action, Darth Plato. What's going on here when they report back?
Well, they report that the peace is over, and they just went from a reconnaissance mission to now it's they want Horatio to join the fleet for the part of an action. They're going to go into the harbor and sink the French ships. I'm not sure where they are. I wish they would have told us.
Yeah, and it seems like they have to go ahead and do something. And it is interesting. There's another situation that goes on before this whole action takes place. And I hope I have it in the right order.
Yeah, I don't know where this takes place. There's not a lot of places in France where you can really mass a lot of warships. I mean, Brest would be the obvious example, but there's not a lot of places. Calais, but I don't think they're at Calais. There's somewhere like I don't know if I heard. I guess that they're probably somewhere around Cherbourg. I'm not sure where they are.
Yeah, it's a good point. It probably is Cherbourg, but what's interesting about this is while Horatio's on shore at the moment, he looks for Mariah. I think that's the girl's name. Returns to the boarding house and finds that it's been kind of locked up. And it's really funny because he's like, "Hey, man, what are you doing at this thing?" And the guy says, "Well, what do you think it looks like I'm doing?" He goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, sir." Like he realizes that he's a gentleman. And I guess it's just kind of like an ordinary person. He doesn't have that snarky remark, and explains that it turns out that Mariah's mother, unfortunately, used the money and didn't use it to pay what she was supposed to pay, and they lost the boarding house. And I find it very interesting that Horatio decides to kind of pay it forward. But maybe this is more of the type of person that he really is, as you said. Here you see the bailiff. Obviously this is debtor's prison, and he speaks to the mother and Mariah, and the mother's like, I wish my daughter would see the back of you. She doesn't say that, but that's what she means. She doesn't want Horatio around. Later on we learn that she was also married to a sailor, I guess. And he died in action at, I can't remember, it was Trafalgar or whatever action it was.
Trafalgar hadn't happened yet.
Okay. And, she's very upset about all this. And, she doesn't want her daughter to be mixed up around with this soldier. But, it seems like it might be something that's inevitable because, they're in this prison and Horatio has done something extraordinary. He's bailed them out. And he's given Mariah the money. And, that really wasn't that common with somebody you don't know. Like, I can understand family. You help family, you give family a loan. But this was something very different. And even her mother acknowledges, she's like, something, I don't know who you are. She's pretty much, I'm almost thinking that what she told him was pretty much stay away from my daughter. Like it was, but I don't know about you.
I don't get the hostility either.
Yeah. I as far as I'm concerned, I just want to get out of debtor's prison, which must have been a horrible place to be in.
Yeah, also notice another thing about that scene. Notice that there were babies crying.
Yeah, of course, they're like little Dorrit. There were babies who were born in debtor's prison, unfortunately.
Right. So they didn't have child services in those days.
Right, and a lot of these kids, even if they were orphans, sometimes they'd end up in the workhouse,
Yeah.
or if their family owed money, you could be living in a debtor's prison for quite some time until that amount was paid.
Yeah.
It really was terrible, a terrible existence. Thank goodness that's not what's happening
Yeah.
now.
Yeah,
But
you can get that's how the Navy, the Army, sometimes they got men. They, especially the Army, they would go into these places and say, "Well, we'll get you out, but you got to join the Army." So that was one place where they would get manpower. That theme, you also see that in the Spartacus series, where you get into debt trouble, you may have to sell your services to indentured servitude, like what happened with Varro. And remember, Varro was a gladiator. So this is a common theme in the past. If you get into financial trouble, you literally have to sell yourself.
yeah, and it certainly must have been very uncomfortable to be in that position. And so, Horatio must seem like a godsend to Mariah. She goes off and pays her debts. It really is remarkable, actually, very feel good moment in the story, and also very telling. At this point, I am kind of wondering what is the relationship between Horatio and Mariah, because that certainly isn't ordinary, but she did help him out. But this really is kind of, I think, maybe a little bit more extreme in a sense. But here we see Horatio with the Admiralty again, talking about whatever action they want to take. I personally am not quite sure what they're doing here. I mean, it seems like they wanted to get this stronghold, this defense location, and they get it. But then it looks like while even before they're able to do that, they get captured. They get double crossed, Darth Plato.
Yep.
What did you think about the double cross that takes place on the
Like,
landing party? That's what I'm going to call them, the landing party.
well, two things. Well, one, that's not really the Admiralty. That's Pelu there. He's a flag officer. Hammond, I believe, is a captain. So what the Admiralty would be like Whitehall. That's not Whitehall. As
Well,
far as
let's say on the sea they represent the Admiralty,
that's
because
yeah,
you know I don't know,
that's
put it
right. So Pelu does have what you would call OTC. That's a term we use nowadays. I'm not sure what they would have used in those days. So he was the officer in tactical command. So
yeah,
he may as well be God on the ship.
yeah.
Um, the plot overall is weak. I've mentioned that, and the Irish angle is a bit convoluted. It is true that there's a history of discontent with the Irish and English. Yes, that is true. There's no doubt about that. But I've never heard of a situation quite like this, where you have Irishmen in the ranks and trying to pull some sort of conspiracy. Maybe a random Irishman would be like, you know what, mump off and punch out his officer. Something like that might have happened. But this, you got one hell of a conspiracy going on here. You have a serving line captain, and that gentleman there, whoever, God, whatever his name was. Interestingly enough, the midshipman is not involved. Interestingly enough. I thought it was convoluted, but okay.
No, I think you make a good point, and certainly not what I was expecting to see. Although it did seem like there were a lot of new faces on the crew, and sometimes with those new faces, you can have people who have differing opinions. And we saw from the beginning that he had a bit of a differing opinion. In fact, he made a snarky remark towards Horatio, where he had said, "Gee, what do you have in here? Are you going to the Indies?" And and of course, that is an expression that of course is parallel to today's comments. But it was interesting that he chose to kind of make
Well,
his displeasure of having to carry a heavy bag unknown to, of all people, the captain right around the corner. It doesn't tied well
well,
on.
to be fair, when he makes a comment like that about the Indies, what there's another layer to this that we don't quite get because we're modern people. We have the benefit of modern medicine. They did not have that. They did not have penicillin. They did not have quinine. In that part of the world, the Western Pacific, South China Sea, the Straits of Malacca, the Indies. In that part of the world, your life expectancy was about 6 months. So that was very undesirable to go to that part of the world for any long period of time. So going to the Indies was really was really. Do I really want to do this?
Well, clearly he doesn't, because he's still in, I guess, in Europe, more or less. And there he is kind of feasting, holding Horatio and his landing party captive and talking, just very smug about everything, honestly. And, Horatio is kind of forced to be at a table with him, and it's not comfortable having to deal with this. They're all kind of
I know.
tied up.
It's so silly. Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
It is kind of silly where they all manage to pull themselves out, but eventually they get rescued by Captain Pellew, which is not a shock, not a surprise. What was kind of interesting, there's a guy who has to go down the toilet, literally to get out. They all had to do that to sneak out. Was Pilyu kind of giving them ground support or ship support, whatever you want to call it, so that they could fight against the troops on the ground. And it was very interesting to see Hammond's nephew and what happens with Hammond
Yeah.
here. Seems like there's quite a few spies there, but Hammond's nephew doesn't seem like a spy to me. He just seems like an innocent bystander in all this, Darth
Yeah.
Plato.
Yeah.
And I kind of feel bad.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't get it. Yeah. I don't get it.
Yeah, it
It's,
is. It
it's, it's tragic because it's the second episode in a row that you see a young midshipman who's has his entire life in front of him, and he gets cut down like that. That happened in the last episode with the midshipman who was being abused by the captain, and then you had the Spanish prisoners getting shot and started shooting people. This, it's tragic.
It is sad. He's literally just a child, and he is shot down. And then, of course, the senior Hammond sees him there on the ground, and he's shocked by this. And I'm thinking to myself, you're shocked? He did go out on an action, right at the heat of it, where people are fighting, and he knew there would be fighting because the older Hammond knew there would be fighting because this was kind of a trap that these guys walked into. So it is kind of interesting that he, was surprised to see his nephew there on the ground perish this way. It was kind of sad, Darth Plato, to see him perish. But
well, to be about a bit positive about this, the action itself, once they land on the shore and start going about the mission, the action itself is pretty good. I don't mind that part. They did that pretty well. There's the tension of they have to take the fort so that the fort doesn't rake the fleet while it's going into to do what it needs to do, and they clearly did not succeed in doing that because it starts opening fire on the British ship, which is the worst case scenario if you're a serving line commander. Do we press on or do we fall back? And Horatio, as we saw, was able to retrieve the situation, and they were able to take the fort with the help of the. That's another thing we didn't really mention is the Horatio knows that there's a traitor in the party, and he's not sure who it is, and he suspects the Frenchman. So Horatio, unfortunately, in a moment of weakness, he does sort of turn to the Frenchman saying, "Is it you?" And it turns out it was not, but that's a good plot point that they could have played out a little more. But I think it's wasted in this episode. I just don't think the overall episode is really very good. The action was decent. I like the battle scene, but this conspiracy of the Irish officers and men doing this, it just seems really convoluted. And for what? And historically, it doesn't make any sense either, because there was no scam between Irish leadership joining forces with Napoleon to try to get Ireland away from Britain. It is true that there were dissidents in Ireland that did go to France. That is true that did happen. There was some talk, but that's all it went. It was just talk. It never was nothing, any sort of military agreement on any sort of scale. Certainly not that would involve a serving line officer like Hammond. So that's a really convoluted angle. It makes for good TV, sure. It makes for good for TV, but I find it very hard to believe.
It was, and you're right. It did look really good on the screen, and that's something that I feel like they've been consistent with in this show is how great they've been able to show a lot of the actions. Even if the actions are not historically accurate and don't really are not supported by the story, it has come across really good. And of course, here, by the time Hammond unfortunately finds his nephew has been killed and he takes his own life, which surprised even me. We find out from Pilyu that because it was a battle, Hammond, the nephew, and the uncle in the record are gone down in, in fighting in battle honorably. Certainly a very neat way to wrap things up in this episode, because goodness gracious, nobody wants to know the truth about this double cross. I think it would
Yeah.
disrupt a lot of things,
Oh yeah.
Plato, and make the everybody feel quite uneasy if they knew the truth.
Look at like I said before, it is true that there was tension between the Irish and the English because the English were ruling over Ireland. Now that did happen. However, that does not mean that the majority of the Irish population wanted to try their luck with France any more so than they did with Catholic Spain back in the 1500s. That's a whole other thing. It's almost like a devil you know rather than devil you don't know sort of situation. To use a modern comparison, look at the British in India. Now, there was a lot of tension with the British being in India in the 1930s, 1940s. But when the Second World War happened, there were people in India who spent their entire life campaigning for an independent India free of the British, who said, you know what, we got to take a step back and not do anything that can hurt the war effort. Because do we really want to try our luck with the Japanese? No, that's not a good idea. And so they helped the British, and they did. And that I suspect it probably was the same thing here. And look at there were Irishmen in the Navy and the Army that served with distinction. If you remember from the Sharp series, Sharp #1 man was an Irishman.
Yeah, this is very true. Excuse me. And it is very interesting to see Pellew kind of say this. And I think maybe this is a point where Horatio is not surprised anymore about what's happened. And we see this kind of event, his face is like, oh, yep, that I guess that's what would normally happen. Horatio goes back to see Mariah, of course, at the boarding house. She's there, and only God knows what she plans on doing. But she's very clear to Horatio. She says, look, as much as I appreciate you paying off my debts, you do realize that if you give me money to pay off my debts on a regular basis, there's a definition for that kind of a woman. And I don't think my reputation can handle it. Everybody's going to know because you keep popping up at my door, like you keep popping up at the door and paying the rent for the whole house.
Yeah, it's the appearance of gentlemanliness. It's not a very gentleman appearance. I think that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. She's like, excuse me, my reputation is at stake, and I really can't have you doing this because if you do this, I'm going to look very bad. And I guess nowadays it wouldn't matter. But yeah, I can understand that would be something that would be very questionable. And I'm sure her mother has given her, although we don't see it in the scene, I'm sure her mother has had told her a few times, look, you better do something about this. As great as he is, if you don't act and something happens, you're going to have to either tell him you can't accept the money or something. But even though the mother does seem a little wishy-washy, I have a feeling she told her, like, Mariah, this isn't looking good for you. You're a kept woman. And, in this day and age, that's not cool. So, Horatio, I think he thought about it, although it kind of felt very spontaneous to me.
It did seem forced, yeah.
It's like, why should Horatio have to marry somebody under those conditions? He could have just told her, yeah, you're right. Here's the last check and I'll leave you alone.
Yeah, I was shocked by it when I first saw it too. Like, really? That's the plot twist?
That's how you end up getting married. Well, I guess it could be worse, but poor Horatio.
If you remember, Sharp's second wife was turned out to be pretty questionable too, but that was a very different situation.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And you make a good point with that, Darth Plato. But here we go with our hero kind of ending up in a situation where he is marrying Mariah. And of course, Mariah is thrilled because that's what she wanted from day one. Like I said, who could blame her? She saw him and she obviously was attracted to him. And that's all she cared about. I don't think whether she thought that, I don't even think she felt she needed him to survive. They have the house, they have an inn. She could live there, into perpetuity if nothing goes wrong with her. But, it is very interesting to see this scenario. I felt a little sad for him, but maybe he'll make the best of it. But certainly not the way I would want to end up married to somebody. So, and
Uh,
so that's pretty much that episode, Darth Plato. You were not that fond of this episode.
not really. The like I said, I just thought that the plot was very contrived and wasn't very well thought out. It was almost a cop out. Episode 4 was much better.
Yeah, it to be honest with you, the two things that I think I would have liked to not have seen was the involvement of the Irish in this episode, and also that plot twist about him marrying. Why couldn't it just be that he loves her, and that's why he married her?
Yeah.
So that's what I would have liked to have seen, guys. And
I
guys,
said one more thing very briefly is that there was another angle that they didn't really touch on, and I'm surprised they didn't. Was that in the previous episode, Mr. Bush outranked Hornblower, but in this instance, Hornblower has leapfrogged Bush. Now, at the higher levels, that would have been a big no-no, but at this point, that was something that you did see, and to an observer at that time, that would have given the appearance of one of two things: either Horatio is an extraordinary officer, or Bush is a below par officer. So the fact that he'd been leapfrogged might give the appearance that Bush is something less than an ideal officer or below average officer, and that could hurt him in the future.
yeah, and to be
He
honest
got
with you,
leapfrogged.
I find Bush to be an extraordinary officer. I think he's
Yeah, he is.
I love when he came to the defense of the guy who was the cook and said, I believe it to have been an accident and not malicious intent. And that was so important for him to speak up at that moment,
Yes.
because it couldn't be just Horatio saying, yeah, he didn't do it. It was on purpose. There had to be another person, another officer who could vouch for that shipment. But as a shipment, he knew he was screwed. He knew he was getting the lashes. But to be honest with you, it's so important to have someone of his caliber speak up in defense of the men. And I can see Bush doing something like that many times at critical times like that, even in a circumstance that was very unusual. Guys, please like and subscribe if you do enjoy today's show with Darth Plato and I. And also,
I,
don't forget.
I just want to say thank you for Tom Jr. Jackson for being here and moderating the channel.
Absolutely. Tom Jr. Jackson, we were all good people. Also, guys, remember tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Eastern, it is a recorded show of Julian and I doing PGS treks. So do check that out. Also, don't forget Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Here, I do Sunday brunch with Russ Whitfield. So do check that out as well. And thank you, Tom, for that. Is this the same one? Yeah. And don't forget on Mondays with Lorraine Creel on the Burnettwork at 6 p.m. for Ladies of the PGS. Darth Plato, where can people find you?
You can find me right here on the show. Positive Fandom. You send me a private message otherwise.
Yes, thank you, Darth Plato. Guys, you can always contact Darth Plato here at Positive Fandom or even on the Burnettwork. He and I are going to be streaming on the Burnettwork. I haven't done it yet, but we are going to be doing it this year. I guess maybe in the second or the third quarter of the year, we're going to start doing it. We're already in the second quarter, but we have big things planned. We're going to continue this historical series and more things like this that we enjoy, but also on the Burnettwork as well. Dr. I want to thank you for joining me for this episode. We have one more episode to go.
Yeah, that episode. Yep, final one.
Thank you for bearing with me going through Horatio Hornblower because I love the series so much. I also want to thank Tom Jr. Jackson as well. We are all good people, Tom. And also, guys, check out Tom Jr. Jackson's channel right here. Guys, look, check out, like, and subscribe to Tom Jr. Jackson's channel. Tom Jr. Jackson, my moderator, collaborator, and friend. Please do subscribe to his channel. He has over 80 reviews on his channel, and he has a special show coming out. Tom, is it called, what is it called? It's about Pops. If you guys like Funko Pops, Tom Jr. Jackson has a show that features Funko Pops. I might even saying it correctly. I don't have it in front of me, Tom. But guys, check out Tom's channel. It's coming up. You don't want to miss his Funko Pop show. Tom is very creative. Embraces. Yeah, the Funko Pop culture. He
No Jaws, no sale.
and certainly thank you, Tom Jr. Jackson says Funko Friday Live. Guys, make sure you check out Funko Friday Live on Tom Jr. Jackson's channel. It's going to be a lot of fun. You don't want to miss it. So please do check that out, guys. And on behalf of Darth Plato and myself, thank you all for joining us today. Absolutely live long and prosper, guys. And remember, guys, no matter where you are in the galaxy, always remember to please be kind. Take care, everybody.